Hi there, boys and girls. Today for Storytime, we're going to read Mr. Wrong by Roger Hargreaves. Notice, he has the wrong shoes on, and his gloves don't match. And a flower pot on his head? That's interesting. Mr. Wrong. Whatever Mr. Wrong did was absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. However hard he tried, he just couldn't do anything right. Just look at his house. Oh dear. One fine morning, Mr. Wrong woke up. He hadn't slept very well because of the way he had made his bed the day before. He jumped out of bed and fell over. Twice. He put on his shoes, on the wrong feet, and he went to the bathroom, tripping over the bath mat. He squeezed out some toothpaste onto the wrong side of his toothbrush and brushed his teeth. Ouch! Then he went downstairs. Bump, 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 bump. Not a very good start to the day. In fact, his usual wrong start to the day. In his kitchen, Mr. Wrong poured some milk onto his cornflakes and missed. As he sat in his kitchen that fine morning eating his dry cornflakes, he sighed. Oh dear, he thought, I wish that everything I do wasn't quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. He's kind of having a bad day, isn't he? Some days are like that. So after breakfast, he went for a walk in order to think of a way to solve his problem. It took him 10 minutes to get out of the house because he kept trying to open his front door outward instead of inward. As he walked along, he passed a worm. "Good morning, dog," he said. The worm grinned. He was used to Mr. Wrong. That's not a dog, is it? Then he met the postman. "Good morning, Mr. Wrong," called the postman cheerfully. "Good morning, doctor," replied Mr. Wrong. Oh dear. And then he met old Mrs. Twinkle, who lived down the lane. "Good morning, Mr. Wrong," she smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Twinkle," replied Mr. Wrong. Oh dear, that's not Mr. Twinkle, that's Mrs. Twinkle. And then he met somebody he had never met before. Somebody who sort of looked like him, but didn't. "Good morning, sir," said that somebody. "Good morning, madam," replied Mr. Wrong. "I'm Mr. Wrong." "I guessed that," replied the person. "Well, I'm Mr. Right. Now tell me, why are you walking along looking so miserable?" "Because," replied Mr. Wrong, "I can't do anything right." He does kind of look like Mr. Wrong. Kind of. "In which case," said Mr. Right, "we'd better do something about it. Follow me." And off he went. And off went Mr. Wrong, in the wrong direction. Mr. Right hurried back and turned him around. "This way," he said, and they walked together to where Mr. Right lived. It was a house in which somehow looked something like the house in which Mr. Wrong lived, but different. This is Mr. Right's house. Do you remember Mr. Wrong's house? Looks kind of the same. Kind of. Mr. Right took Mr. Wrong into his living room. "I think that the only way you are ever going to change is for you to come and live with me for a while, and you may end up being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong about everything. Sit down," he said, "and we'll talk about it." Mr. Wrong sat down and missed. Mr. Wrong stayed with Mr. Right for a month, and during that time, he changed. After 1 week, he was slightly less wrong than he had been before. Do you notice anything different? His gloves are the same now. They're not the wrong color, not the wrong gloves. After 2 weeks, he was even more slightly less wrong than he had been before. No, his shoes match. And after a whole 4 weeks, he was a changed Mr. Man. You could hardly tell the difference between him and Mr. Right. Don't you agree? Mr. Right was delighted. I told you, he cried. I told you that everything about you might end up being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. In fact, he continued, you've really turned out all right. Mr. Wrong blushed. It was the nicest thing that anybody had ever said to him in his whole life. And then he went home and lived happily and right ever after. Now, you probably think that's the end of the story, don't you? Well, it isn't. And the reason it isn't is because of what happened to Mr. Right. The trouble was, you see, that the longer Mr. Wrong stayed with Mr. Right, and the more right Mr. Wrong became, the more wrong Mr. Right became. Isn't that extraordinary? Oh dear, he sighed. My plan didn't quite work out the way that I thought it would, said Mr. Right. And then he went to bed. In the bathroom. The end. Mr. Wrong. Remember, we're all wrong sometimes. Wrong about wearing masks. Wrong about which letter we're talking about. I'm wrong. You're wrong. Sometimes. It's okay. We all make mistakes. If you can't make a mistake, you can't make anything. And we're all wrong sometimes. The best way to handle that is just to say, I'm sorry, and try not to be wrong next time. I hope you enjoyed the story. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.